Stephen Woolfe, and I think my first question to you, Stephen, is this. When Iqbal Mohamed says that we need a screening process, shouldn't the screening process be don't marry your cousin?
I would have thought that was absolutely obvious. Here he is, a man who's an MP, saying he's an intelligent individual, understands the facts, has the whole of the House of Commons ability to give him details. And those details say, as you've quite rightly said in the show already, that when you marry cousins, you're more likely to have birth defects. When you marry your cousins, you're more likely to have children who've got illnesses and sicknesses. We shouldn't be screening for them. We should be telling them quite simply, are you putting your children's lives at risk by being married as cousins?
And do you know something, Stephen? Do you know something? Asher said in the dressing room earlier on something which he intended as a joke, but I think is quite serious. You know, we've all been to our local parks and seen very large numbers of disabled Asian young people being taken around by carers, and it is noticeable that there are large numbers of people who appear to be Asian. So clearly, this 17.5 times more likely is something that you can see on every street when you see groups of disabled people.
Well, it's quite possible there are more. I mean, we can only go on the numbers that we're given, can't we, really? And that's the problem with it. A lot of this statistics are never actually the true statistics. I take that as given for someone who's had to try and follow the Home Office and get details off them for years about statistics of criminality and illegal immigrants. They never give you the full details, and we never get the full truth. But when we do have big numbers like this, it does point to a very simple fact. Marrying your cousin leads to a likelihood of your children being ill, sick, or injured. Now, what they don't say, and what I've not seen in the House of Commons in terms of any speaker so far, is given the evidence of the illnesses similar to what we're finding in the UK, in those countries where you have practices of marrying your cousins. Again, the MP mentioned Saudi Arabia and other countries that have this as a practice. Do we know what the levels of illnesses and sicknesses are?
Well, actually, if you watch this speech in full, he claimed that, I mean, I'm sure this is bullshit, but he claimed that in the Middle East they'd resolved the problems of birth defects by screening the genetics of the first cousins before they get married to work out whether they're compatible or not. I mean, I'm assuming that we can all say that that is just absolute nonsense.
I don't think you could ever be sure, could you, even if you screened it?
Well, the only thing you could do, which I'm assuming we'd all be against, is for you to go through artificial insemination and just pick the embryos that do not have birth defects. It would be an incredibly laborious process, and it would involve you no longer having a sexual relationship with your partner. The whole thing's a complete mess.
The costs would be massive on that.
But here's my next question, Stephen.
I see this as, once again, as quite dangerous thinking. Even the idea that we go down and screening our children to make sure they've got defects just because they're marrying cousins rather than using the common sense practice of don't interrelation marriage. It goes one step further. It's like the idea of the assisted suicide bill. You know, then it's perfectly okay if you people are ill and sick and they might die, but it's perfectly okay if we screen everybody. Then what's next? How does it go on? And I think what we're doing is we're changing our culture and our ideas and our sense of well-being to fit in with a small minority of people who should be, quite rightly and frankly, integrating into this country and our values. We should stop pussyfooting around about this.
But there is
choice to come here.
It shows an insularity as well.
But Stephen, here's what I think is the elephant in the room. Because when Iqbal Mohamed says that 35 to 50% of people in sub-Saharan Africa, Pakistan, places like that, are fine with first cousin marriage, that actually, with respect, is not what's happening in Britain. What they're saying is, over there, they're saying, if you fall in love with your first cousin, it's fine to marry them. And you can agree with that or disagree with that. What is happening in Britain is families are transplanting themselves from Pakistan to the United Kingdom. And therefore, it's not that if you fall in love with your cousin, you can marry them. It's mandatory to marry your cousin because you're having an arranged marriage with them. Because what happens is your dad turns around and goes, I want my nephew to come to the United Kingdom. Therefore, you're going to have to marry him. And so it's not a case of if it happens, it happens. It's become mandatory. And now when you do that for 3 or 4 generations, you start ending up in a real nightmare. So I suspect in countries where first marriage is accepted, I suspect it is not a problem to the extent it is in the UK, because over there they allow it, over here it's compulsory.
That might be the case, but the idea is you picked on a second point that I was going to raise. I think a lot of this intermarriages is just a way of bringing...
What, keeping the wealth in the family, is that what you were going to say?
It's about ensuring that you keep the same community that left, whether it's Pakistan or Sri Lanka or whether it's Bangladesh, all those countries where this happens quite a lot. It's about bringing them over here and keeping that clan close together.
Yeah, it's very insular, and it shows you don't want to actually spread out in, you know, as we would in this culture.
I mean, that's the point, Stephen. I appreciate that you occasionally watch and listen to this show, but you're very busy, so don't watch it all the time. But this was the point that Dr. David Starkey made when he talked about tribal areas, and people started making complaints about what he said. But actually, what he said I thought was eminently sensible. He said what's actually happening here is we are not becoming a multicultural, a multi-ethnic, a multiracial society. What we are doing is we are finding an area of, say, Dewsbury, where now every single house will be people from from one particular community. Person by person, through cousin marriages, the entire village in Bangladesh or Pakistan is being moved to the United Kingdom. And so it's not like when people are coming over, there's one Pakistani family on every street. There are literally ghettos which operate in quite a different way to the United Kingdom. The rest of the United Kingdom, we all know that policing is done differently there. Perhaps your local council will be picked, but not by a political party, but by who's most senior in the mosque, and there's family voting and things like that. And effectively, you now have enclaves, which are effectively foreign lands, not because there's 1 or 2 Pakistanis there, but because every single person that lives there is from one village in the Punjab.
It's very tribal, yeah.
I think that idea of the cultural transformation of Britain is very clear. It's very strong in the north of England, particularly Lancashire and in Yorkshire, parts of Manchester and parts of Leeds. And then you look at Birmingham, where there are different types of enclaves that are happening there and are spreading out. And of course, the biggest example of where you get a mass enclave that leads to not just political power, but the shifting of money around. And in the cases of the Mayor of London, Mayor of Tower Hamlets, was actually convicted of a criminal offence. So you see that there with the Sri Lankan community that is very strong. We cannot ever accept the idea that you have integration where you have distinct enclaves.
Yes.
This is not the situation we want to have where we see it in the United States, where people from vast amounts of communities dominate whole areas, and then they become a political power in that area on itself, taking the money, taking the council money, being able to spread it amongst themselves, and where you don't see integration. I've argued this for a long time in many, many ways, that we don't have a country of integration, and multiculturalism has failed. We have multi-ethnicity. That can work. But multiculturalism in the UK is an absolute
Well, I will tell you, Stephen, I'm originally from Lee. Most people have not heard of Lee, but it's next to Bolton.
You, of course. Andy Burnham.
I used to know someone called Lee.
Andy Burnham, the MP.
Yeah, when I grew up, and I'm not saying this to take the mick, when I grew up, there was one Chinese family who owned the chippy. They were the guys who'd come over from Hong Kong. I'm not joking. There was an Asian family. She was the doctor. And there was one black kid who'd been adopted. And that was it. Now, my point is, obviously Britain has changed significantly since then. But, you know, next door in Bolton, there was a huge Asian population, but the white guys lived in Lee and the Asian guys lived in Bolton. And that was the way it was. And my feeling is that the integration that you're so worried about is a myth in the mind of Polly Toynbee.
Oh, God. I mean, I look at Polly Toynbee with a sense of disgust. That woman is only happy to ensure that she has lovely dinner parties with the right and the good and the people that she finds fine. She's what, in The Road to Wigan Pier, George Orwell would say about socialists. They'd rather deal with immigrants and foreign people in a different language. He used it for black people then, which is unacceptable today. rather than deal with somebody who's working class. She is a fake lover of the working class. She is a fake socialist. She doesn't believe anything other than the rich socialism that Keir Starmer believes in. They ignore the desecration of our country and the lack of integration. They would never go and live in those areas. They'd never employ people from those areas. And for them, as long as they can go and get their coffee cup at a Costa with someone who's lovely from Lithuania serving them, that's integration to them.
But the West was built basically on people not being tribal. I mean, David Stark talked about this. It's because we had systems and guilds, and eventually we all trusted each other, and that was brilliant until about the 1960s, you know, when Dave Starkey says, you know, everyone was helping it was very pleasant, and then it all changed because people came from other places where it's all about tribalism and they don't trust other people, and it sort of broke down. And the way modern society developed, the democracy, it came from, you know, everyone trusting each other to a point, rather than only your family and your tribe.
I couldn't agree more. And the whole reason of a kind of cultural nationalism that was brought out, and initially I sit here in Winchester, the foundation of England, that led to Britain. It was about bringing people together to learn to trust one another, to be able to battle those who were trying to come and dominate our country. In that time, it was the Vikings. And Starkey is correct. When you look at the population numbers, when you look at the immigration numbers, between the 50s and 60s, from those who were coming through the Windrush, the numbers were relatively small. Even when we brought those in from Idi Amin and what happened there, again, relatively small. Larger numbers, I admit, but relatively small. It was Tony Blair's mass numbers from the 1980s, where in 2001, he had 103,000 asylum applications in 1 year, that the transformation began. And the second part was cultural. Most of the people that we brought in were either connected to the Commonwealth and were relatively understanding of Christianity.
Yes.
After that time, we had changes from cultures that were not Christian, didn't understand the way that Judeo-Christian common law systems work together, trust, family, connectivity. And we thought the intelligentsia, the Polly Toynbee.
Tolly Toynbee, yeah.
Tolly Toynbee, no, you've got it, Stephen.
Yeah.
I can't get it. Those
Tolly Toynbee, that's what we'll call it.
That's in Wales, isn't it?
She thought, that type of person thought we could all integrate and bring them into our values. That is nonsensical. History teaches us that unless it's small numbers, over long periods of time, people don't integrate.
What about Stephen? What about this difficult question that I never thought that I'd entertain, but I think now is sensible? I was reading about Sweden, and Sweden have now said to some of their refugees, you know what, your country's safe now, it's time to go home. And of course, these refugees are stunned with horror because they said, we've been here 10 years. Yes, because you're not really a refugee. You've parked your backside in Stockholm and you plan to stay there forever. Are we now at the stage where we need to say, OK, fine, we've granted you all refugee status, but just like the Belgians in World War I, and nobody can remember the Belgian migrants on the south coast, because when World War I was finished, they went back.
I would be absolutely in agreement with that. Of course, we should be encouraging them and actually in many ways forcing them to return to Syria in the large numbers. Now, they said that they were fleeing Assad. Now it's time to go home, and the same in other countries. We've still got some big numbers. I think that, when the Ukraine conflict ends, that there will be large numbers of Ukrainians go back, but I'm certain many of them will want to stay because the life that they get here is a lot better than they would get.
I'll make a point about that. I want to make a couple of points about Ukraine, but before I do, let me just say about Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh. Right.
I was hoping you were going to talk about that.
Azerbaijan took back Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an Armenian area of, it's an Armenian area that used to be traditionally in Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan is Muslim, Armenia is Christian. There were concerns that there was going to be a genocide. As it happened, there actually wasn't. Had there been a genocide against Armenian Christians, we wouldn't have had the space to take them in. We'd have had to leave them to the genocide. But secondly, on the point about Ukraine, this is the thing, having spent some time over there, the women and children that I met, not the blokes, the women and children who came across the border wanted to be as close to their husbands as possible. Now, for some of them, that was Gloucester and Slough, and I accept that. But for the vast majority, it was places like Chisinau, Krakow. I mean, the amazing thing, and I've made this point before, little Moldova used to be the poorest country in Europe. Obviously, Ukraine is now because of the Ukrainian war. But you know something? It had no refugees whatsoever until the Ukrainian war broke out, when it took 350,000. It's got a population of 3 million per capita. Now, why is it that people fleeing Assad's regime, why is it people fleeing from Libya, why is it that all these people, none of them ever considered to go to Moldova, the safe country? And why was it so popular with Ukrainians? The reason it was popular with Ukrainians was because they're genuine refugees and it was next door to Ukraine. Whereas actually, when you see the refugees that we take in, they go, oh, Tokyo seems nice this time of year. What is the level of benefits I can get from them? And let me tell you this, finally, before you respond to all of this. If there was a war in the United Kingdom, we'd go to the Irish Republic. We wouldn't say, oh, I think Turkmenistan seems very nice. You know, it's this idea of going to the first safe country is exactly what the Ukrainians did with Moldova. They crossed the border, and once they were behind Moldovan soldiers and knew that they were safe, they pitched a tent.
Well, that's true, and I will say to the extent that, you know, there are some countries, you know, particularly Iran and in terms of Pakistan itself, actually do take an awful lot that come from Afghanistan, and that same principle that you've got. But what I noticed from the day that Merkel's madness on opening the borders to Germany, to Syria, is what they found out very quickly. It wasn't just Syrians who were coming over. It were those who were coming from, surprise, surprise, East Asia. It was those who were coming from Vietnam. It was those who were coming from Africa. They were all connecting to people smugglers who were looking at a vast fortune for themselves and the ability to transport people who knew they were going to get homes, a future, and also income whilst they tried to work in the illegal markets. And that's what
and change that society. I mean, look at what happened in the German Christmas markets this weekend. They were just all marching because of Syria, and they sort of ruined the atmosphere. It was like thousands of people just walking through these German Christmas markets, chanting and waving, you know, these flags of this new ISIS type group that's now the government there.
And that's what happens when you get people who do not wish to integrate and feel it is their right to be able to dominate the country.
And colonise it, basically.
When there's large numbers of them coming through. Yeah. It's happened consistently over history, where you get one crowd of people so big they move into another country. Others think that they can work together. Eventually they break them down through sheer numbers, and then they're totally dominated. And the country that accepted them in eventually disappears. That's what's happening here in the UK.
Happened in Lebanon, didn't it?
This is just the start.
Yeah.
I have a sense of despair is I love my own English history. I love my English poetry. I love my English paintings from Gainsborough onwards. But then I look around my country and I see my statues being pulled down by people who connect to this idea of not being integrated to Britain. I see my poetry and the history, pictures of my heroes like Winston Churchill being taken down from places like Number 10 by people who don't believe in our culture and our history. And this mass integration of people, of coming across, has led to a change in our culture, a way of destroying it from within. And when it goes, we have nothing.
Well,
we're
going to have to go to a break now. But I'm going to give you a remarkable fact, Stephen, that you can take away back to Centre for Migration.
You never leave empty-handed from this show. Here's a fact.
That modern-day Italians are really not very closely related to Romans at all. Rome was subject to mass immigration, and actually the Roman population moved to Romania, who are much more closely related now to historic Romans. And so all of those things, the Colosseum, the reason the Colosseum was pulled to bits was because the people living in Rome weren't Romans and didn't give a toss.